My name is John Porter, and welcome to this edition of Politics Aside. You know, I've had the honor of serving the public for many years, having had my own business as well. And I'm constantly asked, what was the highlights from a personal perspective in my years of public service and again, in being in business? And the one thing that comes to mind all the time is that I've had the honor of meeting and working with fascinating people from around the world, of course, here in Washington, D.C. and across the nation. And I feel an obligation to share with you some of those experiences. And more importantly, to share with you some of those individuals that I'm talking about that have changed the world. We've talked about music and the impact on individuals. We've talked about business leadership. We've talked about politics, and certainly politics aside is key. And I'll address that more here in a moment. But as I share with you some of the stories and individuals in my journey, I just really want to ask one thing, and that is that you sit back today, try to put politics aside, and join me as we have an opportunity to meet and to listen to some of the leaders from around the world. Now, today, one of my friends for 20 plus years, David Drucker, agreed to join us here on Politics Aside. And, you know, David and his wife, Jenny, literally have been friends for almost 20 years. David has a career in media, has a career in all forms of media, from print to cable to syndicated radio. And David currently is a senior correspondent with the Washington Examiner. His specialty is covering campaigns, Congress, and national trends. Seems like that's pretty appropriate for today. Formerly with Roll Call, currently is a contributing writer to Vanity Fair. Again, as I mentioned, he's done cable news, syndicated radio, understands the in and the outs of Washington, D.C. and its politics. And David is one of my go-to as I'm looking for information every morning as I'm trying to develop my thought process for that given day. So today, again, it's an honor for me to introduce David Drucker. And David has written a fascinating book, but we're going to save the book here just for a second because I think it's all going to kind of slide together here as we look at what's happening in 24. But, you know, when David shared with me his vision, his thoughts for writing the book, it really had to do with what's going to happen in the future. There's lots of books that have been written about, you know, from the weekend warrior perspective on what happened yesterday. But right now, there is so much going on. So David, before we get into the book, just tell me what's happening in Washington, D.C. and how should we as consumers of the media and information, how best for us with your experience to capture what's going on? So again, welcome, David. Thank you.
Yeah, John, thanks so much for having me. And thanks for that lovely introduction. You know, there's, as I like to say, it's never a dull moment here. I think sometimes for a lot of Americans, there's never a good moment here. But if you're a journalist or if you're steeped in politics, Washington is always moving and changing and very fascinating. You know, as we speak, the first Black woman justice has been confirmed to the United States Supreme Court, Ketanji Brown Jackson. She was confirmed with the support of all 50 Democrats and just 3 Republicans. That's how Supreme Court confirmations go these days. I'm sure President Trump would have enjoyed more Democratic support for his Supreme Court nominees, all of whom were confirmed, all 3 of them. Democrats and Republicans continue to work through a new coronavirus relief package of sorts. It's probably going to be in the nature of around $10 billion. And then sort of related to that, and not so wonky, there's been a bit of a coronavirus outbreak here in Washington. I wouldn't call it anything to worry about, but a number of journalists and public officials have come down with the virus, including House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who's going to quarantine for the appropriate number of days now, and that's about 5 days, with vaccines and some of these newer strains of the coronavirus that are not as deadly as the initial strain was, particularly before we had a vaccine. It's less of a concern, I think, than it used to be for people in Washington who, if you're here, you'll notice an uptick in traffic and restaurants a lot more crowded. People are still vigilant, but people, particularly in our business, John, whether as a journalist, as a politician, as somebody who tries to influence politicians, as a lobbyist, as a consultant, our business is people. And it's just so much more effective and enjoyable when you are face to face, in person with people. These virtual things are great because it has lowered the cost to entry when you want to produce video events and see people, but it's not the same as being in the same room with them. And I think that what we've seen in Washington is evidence of that, even though obviously, as we continue to monitor the pandemic or the ends of the pandemic and keep an eye out for new, more virulent strains, people will take appropriate action. So Washington's in many ways back to normal. I think people have been itching to get back to normal. Some people don't like that. I get it. But I think that's where we are. I'll just say as an aside, a few weeks ago, I was at a steakhouse near the Capitol. And to me, it's always crowded, but I walked in one day and I said, wow, I mean, this place is really jumping. And what struck me was that this was a Monday night. Usually I figure Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday for business in town. And I said to the guy that hooks me up at this place, I said, it's a Monday night. He said, no more masks, no more proof of vaccine, and we're just jumping. And, you can take that any way you want, but I think that the further we get into this, the more people get used to it, at least in Washington, and the more people want to take advantage of what regular real life has to offer.
Part of your success has been in your relationships, the individuals that and partisanship is not your thing. You're more about printing the facts and information. And again, why I think you're a great part of PoliticsAside. How difficult has it been to get information over the past year or so in this environment? What's it like finding sources and having communication, since you can't really run into everybody like we used to?
Yeah, look, I think it depends on what kind of information you need. Look, I still, even now and even before the pandemic, utilize electronics, utilize text messaging, emails, and phone calls, and sometimes video, video chatting to track that information and to talk to sources and get people to tell me things I need to know to be able to report stories. But particularly when you want to report sensitive stories, or as I was doing for In Trump's Shadow, reporting my book, trying to go deep into the weeds of stories that are not as easy to tell, but are very apropos for a book or a long magazine piece. I always find that kind of reporting does best when you're in person with somebody and you break bread together, you have coffee, you have drinks, you eat, you have a meal, and it's a social event as well as a business event. And I just think you get more information that way. I think it's how people are comfortable with you. They get a sense that they can trust you if they can. I will also say, just in a different way, that living in a virtual world I thought was more difficult ultimately for two reasons. One, there were so many live events, whether the Republican and Democratic presidential conventions, gatherings of Republican and Democratic groups, where when everybody flies to a location, is hanging out at a hotel, they're there for business, for conferences, for meetings. But in those environments, you're exposed to so many people just walking a hallway, and you're in a less formal environment. And that is a good way to really see politics in action, to see things you wouldn't normally see, and get people to talk about things they may not normally be in the mood to talk about, particularly when you call them on the phone or send them an email and they have the option to ignore you. The other thing I'd say, John, and I remember this.
I remember that.
Right?
Yes,
yeah.
I do. I remember.
Look,
that.
when I have to reach out to you electronically, you have the option to not be available. When you're walking a hallway at a Republican Governors Association meeting, or some group, it's like we say hello and I can corner you, but you probably don't necessarily mind because you're thinking to yourself, I've got some meetings and then I'm off to the pool or something like that. But I remember this specific conversation I had while reporting in Trump Shadow. I was talking to a source that has always been very helpful to me and always had trustworthy information for me. And I remember this individual telling me, normally, and this is sort of, I'm paraphrasing here, but with the air quotes, normally I'd have so much more to tell you, but instead of being in Washington 3 days a week and going to receptions and holding meetings where I'm talking to people and taking in a bunch of information, I've just been at home, and I won't say where he was. I've just been at home and on the phone with people, but I'm just not seeing as many people. I'm not the recipient of as much gossip, and so I don't have as much to tell you. And so that is why, ultimately, I like the world we're living in now or about to live in. I like the pre-pandemic world. And I think that, while I don't want to be critical of people who like working from home and staying home and never getting out, that's fine. That's great. Do what you want. This business, you got to get together with people. You've got to travel. You've got to talk to people in their own environment. That's how you get the most information. That's the most trustworthy information. That's the most interesting information.
With so much information today, and you hear this echo chamber thing where people turn to news that they want to hear, and I do think that happens, certainly in some respects. But where do you turn? I mean, do you pick certain like reporters that you trust, or how does it work for you to gather like the general media information?
It's a mix of picking outlets that I trust and reporters that I trust, and opinion journalists and columnists that I trust. I think that some of the mainstream, or some people prefer the term legacy press, that gets a bad rap these days. I think it's too much of a bad rap because whether you're the Washington Post, the New York Times, or the Wall Street Journal, you're sending reporters everywhere, and you're sending reporters with a lot of experience everywhere. And so, sure, sometimes the news is biased, sometimes it is wrong, sometimes the context is wrong. And because I'm in this business, I got into it because I wanted to do it better. But some of these big brands still do an amazing job. Sometimes they do better on some topics than other topics. But the truth is, when you have an army of journalists and the resources to send them places and have them focus on a beat, you can still glean a lot of information, even if you don't always like what you read or think the journalist is getting it wrong. And look, I find most journalists are actually trying to get it right. To the extent they don't, it's more an issue of worldview than deliberate bias, right? If you've never run a business before, if you've never been to medical school, or you don't understand monetary policy, but you're thrust into reporting on these issues, you may not have the right, what questions to ask. You may not understand the information the policymakers are giving you. But, and all of those things should be addressed, but that's more an issue of worldview and experience versus deliberate cheerleading. And I understand where Republicans are coming from, because they are more often than Democrats the victims of bias in media. But I think it's been misunderstood as deliberate cheerleading versus what I think it is, which is just worldview and experience. Before I was a journalist, I ran a business. I had to make a payroll. I had to deal with government regulations. So I understand that. But there are things I don't understand. And if I had to, all of a sudden, my boss forced me to be a medical policy or science reporter, I'd have to study quite a bit before I actually knew what I was doing. One of the things social media has enabled us to do, for all of its downfalls, is really pay attention to what individual reporters are doing. And there are individual reporters, there are individual opinion journalists, and even just columnists, advocates that I trust to know what they're talking about, deliver really good information, approach topics in a very thoughtful, intelligent way that makes me think. And I just try and follow them, as well as some of the news outlets that I think generally do a very good job.
Well, I appreciate that. And that's why, again, I'm honored that you joined us today. But David, you always do such a great deep dive, and you're very thoughtful in your information, and you're always able to connect dots. And I appreciate that. And I guess, as I look out the windows, we're not far from each other. We're neighbors technically, We're right here on Capitol Hill, and I look out the window. We're in an 1880s house here, but I think about who walks by here every day, and I also look at the Democratic National Committee out one side of my house and our office, and then the Republican committees on the other side. So, as we're going to get into your book here just in a moment, but what's the state of political parties? It seems like both, at least in the Republican and Democrat parties, there's a lot of happening, and there's not a lot of continuity or consensus. So what's happening within the political parties?
Well, look, it depends on how you want to look at it. Generationally, parties tend to change, and ideology shifts. Of an electorate that has been supporting a party gets older, dies out, it's replaced by a new electorate. Issues change, world events change, and parties have a way of being changed by that, right? So we've seen Democrats and Republicans over several decades exchange different demographics. Most recently, we've seen a lot of white working class and union voters, rank and file union voters, shift from being stalwart Democratic voters to more consistently Republican voters. At the same time, we've seen a lot of these college-educated suburban voters that would often vote Republican, at least in presidential elections or certain congressional elections, because they're fiscally conservative and tend to be hawkish on national security matters. We've seen them shift and become more often Democratic voters. And in fact, as bad as the Democrats are doing, when you look at polling for the 2022 midterm elections, Democrats still have an edge with college-educated voters, particularly college-educated women. And so parties will evolve as their voters evolve, as issues evolve. Nobody likes parties, and they blame parties for a lot of the partisanship they see or not paying attention to the issues that they want addressed. And yet parties have never been weaker. The political parties and their committees raise tons of money, but they have very little power. They certainly don't have power over their politicians. They don't have the power to really manage their own presidential primaries. And so I think it's sort of a mixed bag. Whereas, when you started out in politics back in the 90s and even the early
1880s, Dave.
Way back in the day before, they'd invented electricity. If you were a Republican or Democratic leader on Capitol Hill, you could go to a, let's say, wayward member of your party who was supporting a policy you didn't like or saying things that didn't reflect well on your party and say, if you don't cut it out, I'm cutting off all the money. And that politician really had to think about that, because they could send a message that none of the party or the operational support in terms of grassroots support, door knocking and things like that, it was all going to be cut off. But now you can be a malcontent, go on Twitter and claim you're being censored, and you've got supporters all over the country who will send you money. So you don't need the party for money. And you can even put together your own grassroots army by using Facebook and using other social media platforms to put together a community of like-minded people. And so this is how you get around the power of the political parties. Not to mention, Washington is full of official groups,
yes.
Or I shouldn't say official groups. Washington is full of ideologically driven groups, and that's great. And they raise lots of money, and they even employ a few people, and I think that's great too. And I know a lot of these people, and I like them. And how do they make a living? By claiming that the party is getting rich on your dime, and instead of listening to them, you need to listen to me. And it's basically the competition of establishments. It's the official party establishment with the official outsider establishment. We all know who these groups are. I think it's awesome. But all of these groups they all have one thing in common, except for the political parties, which is they all think political parties are awful and they should go away. You should listen to me instead.
Well, on that subject, thank you. You spoke to some of our friends the other day in public, it was great to be back with people. One of the things that you mentioned is that, these cycles, and you and I have seen the ebb and flow of the different political power structures, at Republicans this year, Democrats next year. But one thing you said that seems so true to me is that it's like when somebody gets elected today, it's like they got to do everything today because or it's the end of the world. Talk about that for a second, because that passion you're going to address regarding what's happening in the 2024 race, but talk about that if you would for a moment, that passion.
Well, sure. And yeah, it's a hobby horse of mine, but increasingly in the 21st century, and look, we've seen elections go back and forth, right? Wave after wave, one party's in charge, the next party's in charge. Nobody really has a hold on power. But every party complains every time they lose or are about to lose that they're never going to be in power ever again. And so they better do everything they have the power to do now, because that's it. It's all over. Like literally, that's it. So if you listen to Republicans in the 2020 campaign, you probably heard a lot of them say something like, look, if we lose this election, the Democrats are going to make it so we can never win ever again. So one, that's how dire things are. The country is on the verge of collapsing. And two, whatever power we have to do right now, we better do it, because if we lose, we are out of power indefinitely. And so
That's so prevalent, David. I hear that every day. It's like, oh, we got to get this now. This is the last chance. And it's like, take a deep breath, right?
So guess what? So Democrats did win. And since that happened, Republicans haven't had much power to do much. But now what's about to happen? Well, Republicans are about to win control of the House and Senate. And so what are Democrats saying? Republicans are rigging this thing so that we can never hold power ever again. So anything we want to do, we better do it now, because in the year 2022, that's it. Over. And so how do policymakers react? They react by swinging for the fences constantly. And voters, of course, keep saying, stop doing that. And yet they keep electing the same sort of people to do that. But we've seen this with presidents in particular. Members of Congress have gotten in on this act, but we've really seen over the past 20 years or so, Republican and Democrat alike, presidents come in and they're built. I don't think they're doing this to build their legacy. I think this is something reporters do. Is this a legacy thing? Are you doing this because you want to be remembered? But I do think presidents, they run nationally, and the ego it takes to be president is understandable, because otherwise you don't win. You don't even run. And so you win and you're thinking, I want to do the biggest thing ever. And instead of just trying to hit singles and doubles, and then the occasional swing for the fences, all you do is swing for the fences. And occasionally you succeed. All you do is alienate half the country. And a lot of times you fail, still alienate half the country, plus disappoint your own supporters because they don't think you should have ever failed. And it's wash, rinse, repeat. And I wonder, John, and we've talked about this, I wonder if somebody will eventually come in and say, just for the heck of it, I'm going to try and hit singles and doubles, see what develops, maybe try and do one big thing, but try and bring the country together by not doing too much that half the country won't like, but doing enough that my supporters and my coalition will appreciate, and see if that lowers the temperature and makes everybody happier.
Well, we see
nobody
that
wants
all the time, David. It's like we have to do comprehensive. We have to do it all or nothing. And of course, we could have a whole session on that thought process. But when we talked about your new book that was being published this fall, last fall, and into this early winter, in Trump's shadow, the one thing you were very consistent about is that, again, there's a whole lot of books that have been written about the way it was. And I thought it was really interesting that in Trump's shadow, the battle for 2024 and the future of the GOP, you're looking ahead. And I know, like, as we chatted the other day, you're probably going to have an addendum here pretty soon, because just things do change, every day or every hour. But tell us about the book. So tell us what you think is really going to happen in Trump's shadow moving into this 2020. Well, actually today into 2024.
Well, look, I approached In Trump's Shadow as a look at a shadow campaign going on for the Republican presidential nomination in 2024 while Trump was still president, which was fascinating enough as it was. Usually you wait for your president to run for re-election, win or lose, and then you get to do whatever you want for yourself. but there were a number of Republicans beginning in 2017 who were plotting their 2024 campaigns, and rivalries were developing. And that's how In Trump's Shadow started. And then it developed into a book about Trump's impact on the Republican Party. And I think the title is so apropos because I think what you're going to see in 2024, regardless of whether or not Trump runs, and I think it's 50-50, good chance he runs, good chance he doesn't. Most people that talk to him today believe he is going to run. But what you will see in that campaign is a bunch of candidates competing to be the next Trump versus what we experienced in the Reagan era, a bunch of candidates competing to be the next Ronald Reagan. And I really do believe that Donald Trump represents a generational break with the Reagan era of Republican politics. And one of the things that I think you will see, and you're already seeing in 2022 Republican primaries for the House, for the Senate, for governor, is candidates focused most on trying to convince Republican primary voters that they will fight for them, that they are fighters. Ideology is almost, it's not passe, but it's just a given. So how are they trying to separate themselves? Not by being the biggest hawks on illegal immigration or being the biggest tax cutters or being the most pro-life on the issue of abortion. They're trying to convince Republican primary voters that I will fight for you more aggressively than my opponent. And in some cases that develops into some candidates acting rather clownish as they try and imitate Trump. In others, it sparks a lot of heated rhetoric as everybody goes out of their way to try and prove that they're just as pugilistic and combative as Donald Trump. But it's a good preview of what you will see in 2024. Now, in some cases, particularly if Trump doesn't run, because I think if Trump runs, the field will be smaller and the candidates that run are going to have to differentiate themselves from him somehow. But I think that he is going to loom over the field, whether he's a candidate or not. And then what I did within Trump's Shadow is try and give you a lay of the land for who these people are, the way they are approaching 2024, what sets them apart, and what you can look for.
And before we get into some of those characters, you mentioned early in your book about the information anonymous deep dive and the attitude of people that you interviewed. Can you talk about that interview process, how that unfolded as well?
Well, look, and I had to do this in the middle of a pandemic, so it was a lot of Zoom. And I kept waiting for the pandemic to be short-lived. And my wife finally said, if I were you, I'd start scheduling Zooms. And she was right. Look, in the case of trying to report a book like this, it was difficult in some ways because I really wanted to take a lot of what was happening during the Trump administration, but look forward, right? So not just tell the story of what happened, but tell the story of certain things that happened in a way that would explain to us what was coming next. My biggest goal with the Trump, with In Trump's Shadow, was to give people a window into the future as opposed to a window into history. And so my interviews were all based on trying to do that. And in fact, when I interviewed President Trump at Mar-a-Lago, and this was after he left the White House, and I spent a few hours with him at his social club in Palm Beach, Florida, I had a list of questions, and it was all based on what's next for him, for the party, for people that I'm writing about. And so I had this other list of questions that I initially put together for myself and realized that that's all about yesterday. And as newsy as it would be, and as much as I want to press him on this, the journalist in me wanted to press him on, why'd you do this? And what about when you said that? And aren't you responsible for this? I realized that that was telling a different story, and that wasn't my story. And so I had to take all of my interviews and keep the theme of the book in mind, the goal of my book in mind, and go from there.
So having done this deep dive and people, spoke on the record, off the record, and I guess it depends on if they were politicians or in the fundraising mode, or I'm sure different personalities. And we're now really ramping up into the primaries where some of these people that you talk to are probably now less likely to discuss it. But we're seeing, as you mentioned, people, candidates are trying to sound like Trump, be like Trump. Is that going to help? And I know you're not a political consultant, right? But do you think that's going to help some of these candidates in their primary to try out Trump?
I don't think so. And in fact, one of Trump's confidants told me when I was reporting the book that a mistake that some candidates would make, and we're seeing some of that in congressional primaries this year as we speak, the mistake that some candidates would make is they would simply try and ape Trump, right? They would try and do their best impression of what Trump does, how he talks, the language he uses, his uniquely combative nature. And what this Republican operative told me is that that would not work. That in order to be successful, you have to find a way to channel Trump in a way that is authentic to you. And when I say channel Trump, channel his fighting spirit, if you will. Obviously, sometimes he fights too much in a way that undermines him with voting blocks Republicans need, and sometimes undermines his own agenda. But, Republican primary voters have come to expect a fighter because they saw Trump win in 2016. And so they think it works. And in some ways, Trump proved that it did work, although in some ways it undermined him the next time around. But if you just try and do your best impression of Trump, voters will view that as inauthentic. And so for any Republican running in any primary, yes, you want to channel that fight that Trump exhibited, but you've got to do it in a way that people are going to believe that you're not just pretending to be Trump, but that you're truly being who you are. And look, it's politics, right? Then you just got to hope it works. You got to hope the timing's right. You got to hope that, as they judge you compared to your opponents, that they like you the best. Those are things you cannot control. But when you try and pretend to be something they want these days, that voters tend to have good radar for that, and they don't like it.
So I may have mentioned this, but we were fortunate to have Glenn Bolger and Zach McCreary, two of the top pollster Republican Democrats, in Washington, D.C. And one of the things that, I asked them was about, are people being really truthful with you when you ask, about a particular poll? And they were very, very blunt in saying people really want to talk. Well, what I'm hearing in this campaign cycle is that people want to talk, but they do want someone that's going to be out in front and fight for them, as you mentioned. But if we look at the candidates today that are trying to act like they're fighting, there's also don't say bad things about Trump mentality as well.
Correct. So you can disagree with President Trump, right? If you're running in a Republican primary, and I'm generalizing here because it depends on how you're running and where you're running and who your opponent is. And there are a lot of things in play. But for example, you can disagree with President Trump on immigration policy or fiscal policy or foreign policy, or pick something. What you can't do is badmouth him. In fact, there are Republican voters I've talked to that hope Trump does not run in 2024 and would like to see a changing of the guard. But they don't like it when other Republican politicians badmouth him. So even though they don't want him as their nominee again, even though these voters that I've talked to think that he's been counterproductive to the party in many ways, particularly his focus on the 2020 election and his claims that it was stolen, they wanted him to win re-election. They like his agenda. They appreciate what they view as his accomplishments, and they want the party to build on that, to embrace it, to keep it. And they don't want to see Republicans criticizing Trump, even though they themselves will tell me, I wish you wouldn't say this or do that. So they don't mind talking about their criticism of Trump to me or to others, but they don't want to see a big food fight where other Republican office holders are going after the former president.
Well, and on that topic of public opinion and what they're feeling, I'm sure these numbers have changed in the last week. But of interest is the Hill ran, an article amongst other organizations ran this story where Harris, the polling firm, and Harvard, not a conservative bastion in any respect, although one of the most respected schools in the country. Their poll said that if Biden and Trump were up today, which would have been 10 days ago now, I guess, Trump would win by about 6 points, which is a 47% to 41%, and then undecided's 12. How much of that is Trump? How much of that is the environment? How much of that is $4 a gallon for milk and gasoline at $5 a gallon? Or is that Trump, or is it anti-current decision making?
I think when voters are presented with a binary choice and they're particularly upset with the leadership they have, they will pick the only other option they have because anything is better than what is happening. And I think that these snapshots are very interesting and fun to talk about, but I don't think, and I said this, 3-4 years ago when we were getting the same questions about Trump versus Hillary again, or Trump versus Biden, if is he gonna run or not? You don't really know what competition looks like and how it's going to unfold until it happens. Because let's say, for example, that 1 year from now, Donald Trump jumps into the race, Joe Biden announces his reelection, and instead of Joe Biden and the Democrats being solely responsible in voters' eyes for a million bad things that they don't like, it's now Joe Biden and House and Senate Republicans that are sharing responsibility. And maybe all of a sudden voters feel better about Biden's leadership. Maybe they don't really like what Republicans are doing because they're not doing what I think I elected them to do. And Biden is actually, holding them at bay. In other words, these things are snapshots in time. And so I think that what it tells you is, don't think that Trump could not win again just because of the way he left office the first time. On the other hand, we have to know who he's running against and how voters feel about the political and policy environment at the time to understand exactly where he stands with the electorate.
And I always figured that's kind of like the Waze app or the GPS. It could take so much time to get to New York right now, but if we wait 2 hours, it's going to change. So I'm with you, and I understand. And of course, polls are used and played. Although I think especially after Glenn being here and Zach, how they have to be truthful. I mean, they have to be spot on. But again, having said that, with your crystal ball, how does the election look in November for the House and the Senate? What are you predicting today? I know it could change tomorrow. What do you think is going to happen?
Well, look, if the midterm elections were held today, Republicans would win control of the House and Senate, and probably by substantial margins. And so if things continue as they are, with President Biden's job approval ratings in the low 40s and the generic ballot, which is how we gauge which party voters want to be in control on Capitol Hill, Republicans continue to have an edge in the generic ballot, and they actually have an edge, right? They're not just tied or trailing by a point or two, but they're actually in front. These things continue, Republicans are going to have a really good election night. I could see upwards of 25 to 35 House seats. I could see 3, 4, 5 Senate seats, depending on how much they can expand the map. So Republicans are just in a really good situation. Now, we still don't know who all of the nominees are going to be. We still don't know what the political environment is going to look like around Labor Day. But we have also seen this century in midterm elections that end up good for one party and bad for another party, that these things tend to crystallize a little bit early, right? We see presidents with low job approval ratings in the midterm cycle, and they don't dig themselves out by Labor Day. They tend to just kind of be where they were. And, the party that appears to be surging in terms of House races and Senate races tends to surge. Interesting thing, John, and you've seen this before, a lot of times in these wave elections, several of the contests are decided by a point or less, a couple of points. They're super close. It's just that the party benefiting from the wave wins them all, or almost all of them. So I still would expect to see a lot of really close races. But if it's a wave, then Republicans will win most of those races.
Now, our job, yours and mine, is to see things as they are and predict the best we can on what's going to happen. So again, not as a political consultant, either one of us in this respect, but it just in practical application, how can the White House, and again, a lot of things inherited, a lot of choices, but a lot of inherited challenges. How can they turn this around with his poll numbers being in the upper or lower 40s? How in time? There's not a lot of time left, is there?
No, and I don't. Excuse me. I don't know that President Biden can turn it around. Now, in theory, President Biden could choose a different policy course, could try and move ahead with a bunch of centrist policies, particularly on energy exploration, and a more, let's say, centrist approach to dealing with inflation. But he doesn't appear inclined to change course from a policy perspective. And if he did, I don't know that he would solve the problem that he's going to have, according to polling we've seen, that has to do with Democratic enthusiasm and whether or not they're going to show up in substantial numbers in November and vote for the Democratic candidate for Congress. So I think that they might just be stuck. The best thing that can happen to President Biden is Republicans politically. I realize policy is a different story, and people make, and people are involved in this for different reasons. But as a matter of politics, I tend to think the worst thing that ever happened to President Biden was the Democrats won those Georgia runoffs and gave Democrats control of the Senate, because it took away the president's incentive to work with Republicans in a more bipartisan fashion, and definitely took away his explanation that he would have been able to deliver to the majority, the Democratic majority in the House, that he has no choice but to work with Republicans.
Because that check and balance wasn't there for that debate, right?
And, correct. And so the best thing that may ever happen to him is Republicans winning control of the Senate and the House, because in the next cycle, he will not be able to run roughshod, nor will there be an expectation that he should run roughshod. And his inclination, not necessarily on policy, because he's really been a doctrinaire liberal throughout his career. It's just in our current political climate, he doesn't act like a jerk, so he's seen as a moderate, but he'll be forced to govern more like a moderate at times. Or when he's saying no, he can say, listen, I'm holding back those Republicans from going too far. They've got to meet me in the middle. It gives him more to work with, and it gives him some independence from his party. And it just might work for him politically. And clearly what he's been doing has not worked for him politically.
Well, and in fairness, 4 years, pardon me, into 24 is a long time for the White House, for the president. We've discussed, first term, presidents normally push their agenda left or right, and then there's a little bit of time to moderate. But, 24 is a long ways away, right? For the race.
Yes and no. Well, yes and no. I mean, sure, it is. But the day after the midterm elections, all of these Republicans that are considering a presidential bid are going to be off to the races, even more so than they already are. And they're already, running through Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina, like the race has already started. So they're going to be off to the races. If Trump decides to run, he doesn't have to get in right away because of the money and name ID that he has, to say the least, but he could. And so this race could get underway really quickly. And Biden is going to have to make a decision, given his age. Does he run again? And if he's going to run again, he's probably going to make a decision. Either way, I think that decision for him has to come sooner, because it's not assumed. Because if he doesn't run, he has to give his potential Democratic successors enough time to ramp up campaigns, raise money, and compete. And if he belabors the decision or waits, of course, the talk is going to be so, the tension from is he or isn't he is going to be so big, given his unique position with his age, that it's going to be a big distraction. So I would expect that the sensible thing to do is for him to make decisions right away. The big question mark I have is Trump really doesn't have to say anything right away. He can continue to coordinate with his super PAC and raise a ton of money without all of the financial disclosures that happen when you're a candidate, well into the summer and early fall of 2023 in advance of the 24 primaries, because he doesn't need to campaign everywhere. And he's campaigning everywhere anyway. But my point is, why do candidates get started early, especially in this era? You need to raise money. You need to garner name ID. All of it, you need to build an operation. Well, he doesn't need to do any of that. So he could really take his time, and I'll be curious to see if he does.
Well, you do, and I know we're running out of time, and I appreciate you being with us. But you spend a good share of your effort in your book talking about some of the other potential candidates. So, can you just take a moment and kind of just summarize, some of the other folks that you looked at in the book that could be candidates?
Sure. So in Trump's shadow, to get a feature, and the candidates potential candidates, they hate when I call them candidates. They're candidates, but when I was reporting in Trump's shadow, I was focused on candidates that were planning their White House bid before Trump had even run, or before Trump had won or lost his reelection bid. So I didn't pay a lot of attention to Florida Governor Ron DeSantis because he didn't fit the mold and really only emerged as a leading contender as I was putting in Trump's shadow to bed. One of the most intriguing candidates I did focus on was Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who was running a very intriguing shadow campaign while at the State Department, meeting with business, political, and other leaders, traveling the country domestically to talk about foreign policy. But hey, it doesn't hurt when you go down to the villages in Florida, a key Republican voting bloc, to talk about a foreign policy, because if you want to come back later in a presidential bid, well, they've already seen you, they know you, they've taken the measure of you. His activities as Secretary of State were really fascinating. Ted Cruz has continued to plan to run again. He was the runner-up in 2016. Republicans have a history of nominating the runner-up the next time around, so I keep an eye on him. Vice President Mike Pence, when I was putting the book to bed, seemed like an afterthought to some people, but because of this fight with President Trump over his handling of the congressional certification of Joe Biden's Electoral College victory, is now a bigger part of the conversation. And sometimes the biggest challenge you have is being a part of the conversation. I'm really intrigued to see where Pence takes this. Nikki Haley has put together a really robust political operation, even though a lot of people have written her off. I wouldn't. She's got challenges, but she is still a draw on the fundraising circuit. She has a super PAC. She has a political action committee as well as a political nonprofit. And it's just a very robust political operation that can sort of become a campaign if she runs. Marco Rubio may not run, but I focused a lot on him because he has tried to put together a domestic agenda that puts meat on the bones of Trumpism. So he emerged from that 2016 campaign, particularly after Trump won the presidency, and said, wow, Republican voters really want something different from us. And so he has tried to fill that void. Tom Cotton is somebody that I would keep an eye on because he plans to run. He is relentless, and he is traveling a ton through a number of states and is just very active. Still has to work on his personality, may never get there with that, but there's nobody that's more organized and fearless possibly in the field of potential candidates. And then somebody I'd mentioned that I did not get into a great deal of detail in the book, but I've just been fascinated to watch, is Chris Christie. And not because I think he's a front runner for the nomination, but because I think he's proven that he's learned one of the big lessons of 2016, which is if you want to be the man, you've got to go after the man. So he's been very critical of President Trump on his stolen election claims and other matters. And the fact that he's been willing to go toe-to-toe with Trump doesn't necessarily tell me that he'll get anywhere doing it, but that he learned a lesson. And the lesson of 2016 is you don't dance around trying to get rid of second and third tier candidates or getting rid of a bunch of front runners, except for the guy at the top of the polls, which was Trump. You just go straight for the guy at the top. That's the only way voters are going to respect you. It's the only way they're going to see you as presidential, at least on the Republican side. Christie's figured that out. And so I'm going to have a good time watching him because he clearly wants to run no matter what Trump does.
David Drucker, friend, please give Jenny a hug and the kids. It's great to see you again. And I have to quote from your press release, if you don't mind. In Trump's shadow, the battle for 2024 and the future of the GOP, based upon extensive reporting, a Game of Thrones-like telling of what comes next for factions and families within the Republican Party as they plot for supremacy in the post-Trump era. David, thank you for being a part of Politics Aside. Look forward to seeing you very soon. Please, everyone, order Amazon, your local bookstore, please, in Trump's shadow. Again, thanks, David. All the best.
Thanks a lot, John. Appreciate it.
Take care.